Trans people have visibly existed in different cultures throughout recorded history, but trans rights have really been gaining attention and progress in the last 70 years. The term transvestite was first coined in 1910 by Magnus Hirschfeld, who later coined the term transsexual, which was translated to English in 1949. This eventually evolved into the word transgender, which is the most accurate and commonly used term today. To start off, I want to make sure that we're on the same page with the terms I'm going to be using. This will probably be a review for most of you, but it's still important to make sure that everyone understands. For starters, biological sex is physical, and gender is how you identify. To be transgender means to have a gender identity that doesn't line up with the gender you were assigned at birth. To be cisgendered means to have your gender identity line up with the one you were assigned. To be non-binary means to have a gender outside of the binary of male and female, and there are both binary and non-binary trans people. Both transgender and non-binary are umbrella terms which encompass a broad category of identities. Some trans people choose to physically transition through hormones and/or surgery. Some don't. Gender dysphoria is the discomfort that one feels with their assigned gender, and is an actual medical diagnosis. To quote author Andrea Long Chu, "Dysphoria feels like being unable to get warm, no matter how many layers you put on. It feels like hunger without appetite. It feels like getting on an airplane to fly home, only to realize mid-flight that this is it. You're going to spend the rest of your life on an airplane. Feels like grieving. Feels like having nothing to grieve." Being trans is not a choice, and if someone tells you that they are trans, you should believe them. Now that we've established some definitions, let's dive into some history. Again, trans people have existed in the US for centuries, but we have to start somewhere, so let's start in the 1950s. In 1952, Christine Jorgensen became the first American trans woman to become a public figure. Although she was not the first to transition, Jorgensen became a celebrity and used her fame to spread awareness about trans issues. In August 1966, the Compton cafeteria riots became one of the first trans rights riots against transphobic police. That same year, Harry Benjamin wrote The Transsexual Phenomenon, a book outlining the ways that trans people could medically transition. But by far one of the most famous events in queer history was the Stonewall riots of 1969. On June 28th, the police raided Stonewall Inn on Christopher Street in New York. They began rounding up the feminine-presenting patrons and asking for identification, which they refused, as cross-dressing was illegal at the time. Stormy DeLarve, a lesbian drag king, is credited with fighting back against the police, beginning what became known as the Stonewall riots. LGBTQ patrons fought the police, including legendary trans woman Marsha P. Johnson. Although Johnson is often credited with starting the riots, she has stated that she actually arrived around 2 a.m. The riots lasted for 3 days and gained significant media coverage. This has been credited as the start of the gay liberation movement. After Stonewall, the Gay Liberation Front was formed. It was anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and anti-traditional gender roles. In 1970, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera started the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, aka STAR. Together, they started the first LGBTQ youth shelter that provided aid to trans sex workers and other marginalized members of the community. The two will soon have a monument dedicated to them in New York City. On June 28, 1970, the tradition of pride parades began to commemorate Stonewall. Since then, a lot of progress has been made in trans rights in this country. In 1975, Minneapolis became the first city to prohibit discrimination against trans people, and in 1993, Minnesota became the first state. In 1987, the American Psychiatric Association added gender identity disorder to the DSM as a classification for trans people, and has since then updated the term to gender dysphoria, a diagnosis which you could find in the DSM-5. The first Transgender Day of Remembrance was organized in 1999 to remember the people whose lives had been lost to anti-trans violence. Medicare began covering gender-affirming surgery in 2014, and in 2015, President Obama became the first U.S. president to mention transgender rights in his State of the Union speech. While it's important to recognize the strides that have been made in the fight for trans equality, it is also necessary to examine the issues that still plague trans people. Violence against trans people is a major issue, especially for trans women of color. 10 black trans women have been murdered thus far in 2019. Dana Martin, Jaslyn Ware, Ashanti Carmen, Claire Legato, Malaysia Booker, Michelle Tamika Washington, Paris Cameron, Chanel Lindsay, Chanel Scurlock, and Zoe Spears. The number of times that I have rewritten this sentence to include yet another murder is too many, and by the time you hear this, more trans women might be dead. Trans women of color make up 4 out of every 5 anti-trans killings in the U.S. Beyond violence, discrimination can greatly impact the lives of the trans community. The unemployment rate among trans people is 3 times higher than that of the general population, and over 3/4 of the trans population have experienced some form of workplace discrimination. The National Transgender Discrimination Survey show that 26% of trans people lost a job due to bias, 50% were harmed on the job, 20% were evicted or denied housing, and 78% of trans students were harassed or assaulted. As a result, 1 in 8 trans people will become involved in underground economies such as sex work and drug trafficking in order to survive. If they are imprisoned for these activities, trans women are 10 times as likely to be assaulted by their fellow inmates and 5 times more likely to be assaulted by the staff than any other prisoners. This culture of transphobia can be especially harmful to trans youth. For one thing, roughly 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ. According to a 2018 survey, 84% of gender-expansive youth have received verbal threats because of their identity, and 42% have received physical threats. 35% of trans youth have attempted suicide in the past year. Our current administration has been particularly harmful to the trans community. As many of you know, the ban on transgender troops in the military went into effect on April 12th of this year. This policy bans anyone with a diagnosis of gender dysphoria who has received medical treatment from joining the military, and also blocks all funding for transitional surgery. Additionally, several proposed policies are specifically targeted at the trans community. 2 of the most recent policy proposals come from the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Department of Health and Human Services. The HUD proposed a new rule in late May that would weaken Obama-era protections for homeless transgender people, allowing federally funded shelters to deny people admission on religious grounds or force transgender women to share bathrooms and sleeping quarters with men. The HHS proposed a new rule that would end protections of trans healthcare rights. This policy would interpret sex as the, quote, plain meaning of the term, and wouldn't extend protections from discrimination on the basis of sex to trans people. These are only a few of the policies that have been suggested or implemented, and I would like to encourage that all of you look further into the LGBTQ discrimination prevalent in this administration. Now, although I am strongly pro-trans rights, I also have to show you the perspectives of those who stand opposed. The groups that provide the main opposition to trans rights are conservative Christians and trans exclusionary radical feminists. Both groups ground their ideas in the belief that gender and biological sex are immutably the same thing, although trans exclusionary radical feminists may state they believe that gender doesn't exist and that biological sex is therefore the only thing that makes you a man or a woman. The fundamental belief is that trans women and trans men are not in fact the gender with which they present and identify, and that non-binary people are just trying to be special. Many think that to acknowledge trans people and their right to exist would essentially be a lie, and could have serious societal ramifications. To quote conservative commentator Ben Shapiro, "There are indeed public policy consequences to the question of transgender pronouns. Those public policy questions all revolved around a central issue. Can subjective perception trump objective observation? If the answer is yes, tyranny of the individual becomes the order of the day. We must all bow before the subjective wants, needs, and desires of people who require special protection from life's realities. We must re-educate generations of people to ignore science in favor of feelings. We must strong-arm individuals into abandoning central planks of their morality in the name of sensitivity." The main issue with these debates is that the two sides are approaching the issue with fundamentally different definitions of specific concepts and a different view of the world. I would, of course, encourage that each person thoroughly researches all sides of the debate to gain a better understanding, but please do pay attention to the way that transphobia and the reduction of trans people to simply a topic for cis people to debate the existence of can be harmful to an already marginalized community. This video was only a brief synopsis of trans rights and issues in the US, and I would highly suggest that each of you take the time to research and try to understand this topic. I know that it sounds cheesy, but even the smallest things can have a huge impact, and that impact is needed. Also, please don't forget the trans women of color who fought hard and sacrificed everything for the rights of LGBTQ people everywhere.